Okay, there we go. So, sunny Gothic is actually very appropriate to what I'm talking about today. I think Victorian art is very sunny Gothic in general, as we will get into in a little bit. And hopefully, Katrina, I'm not going to disappoint you too much because we're not talking so much about occult art as art you may not think of as occult, but actually kind of is. Um, and yeah, I guess my first admission is that I don't really think of myself as someone who works on the Gothic TM, at least not in the way that many of you probably do. And while preparing for this talk, I was reflecting on the reasons for this. Um, because I do work on, as Emily was suggesting, almost exclusively on things that are very much aligned with the Gothic in its literary sense, I think, ghosts, horror, the uncanny, hauntings, the occult. So why not Gothic? And there's one kind of straightforward answer, and that's because I'm an art historian. And the term Gothic means something very specific in my head, especially in the 19th century that I work on. In art history, when we speak of the Gothic, we're usually referring to something quite limited and specific, which is the Gothic revival. It's Barry and Pugin, it's Horace Walpole's Strawberry Hill, medievalism, church architecture, which I have to admit are parts of the Gothic I'm not particularly interested in. And I do know that there's overlap with the literary Gothic even here. And yet, when we talk of the Gothic in literature, I think we're speaking of something much more expansive and something much more productive, a certain set of effects for which Gothic is a useful analytical or maybe even sort of umbrella term. This is the world of the haunted, the uncanny, the spectral, the return of the repressed. And it's true, though, that when it comes to Victorian visual culture, these effects do abound, although maybe not in the ways that we'd expect, especially in the art that I work on. So I work mostly on painting, photography, and sculpture in Britain in the period spanning sort of mid-century, 1860 to 1914, the First World War. And the dominant current, or I guess character of art in this period gravitates around the question of beauty. And, I'm speaking here of aestheticism and its affiliates, the movement that really emerged under the banner of art for art's sake. Art whose principal meaning is beauty, as the poet Swinburne once said, art whose reason for being is simply to be. Art that is centrally interested, I guess, in pursuing ideas about art. And on the surface, I think, although I'm very curious to hear other people's opinions, this art often doesn't seem very Gothic at all. It's glossy, it's dazzlingly colorful, it's often monumental, it's verdant, it's sometimes sunny, as we'll see, and it's absent of narrative. These are sort of not your canonical stories of haunting. But one thing that has always struck me about it is how often this pursuit of beauty, of art for its own sake, brings us into a strange territory that I think does tip us into the familiar territory of the Gothic, perhaps even exceeds this territory to move us into something that's closer to horror, into the grotesque, the excessive, the monstrous, and the morbid. This is art in which the body is opened up, the body is made porous, the body is taken beyond itself. And if you know anything about me, you know that I'm very much using these adjectives non-derogatorily. I'm obsessed with the productive monstrosity of Victorian art and its irreducible strangeness. And something I think is really at the heart of this particular convergence of effects is artists' engagement in this art with new ideas about the human, about nature, about being and embodiment as these were emerging from, I would say, sort of very broadly speaking, two places in the mid-19th century. From, on the one hand, developments in science, so especially via Darwin, and on the other hand, from the rise of occultism and occult beliefs, and the two are, as we will see, interrelated. And we'll get into this more in detail when I get to the meat of my talk, but I want to begin with a passage that lives rent-free in my mind, and that I think about often when trying to get at this specific, I think rather Gothic, or what I tend to call occult, quality of so much Victorian art, especially art that's obsessed with beauty. So don't read this, I'm going to read it for you. This is the art critic T.J. Clarke in the London Review of Books trying to come to terms with a specifically British notion or understanding of beauty in the 19th century. For him, and I agree, these questions are very much wrapped up in period ideas about nature. He begins, before this passage that I've put up here, with a contrast to the French understanding of beauty, which for him is that of landscape. Its distance, its openness, its expansiveness, its vistas, it's happening to the eye. But in Victorian England, he says things are different. He writes, if for some reason the eternal, untouchable middle distance of landscape in the eye is foreign to us on our island or unattainable, then let there be horrible, stifling closeness in its stead. The hawthorn bearing down on poor Merlin like a leprous second skin. And I think he very much has this Burne-Jones painting on the right, The Beguiling of Merlin, in mind there. He writes, this is nature as overgrownness, a vision of things with Darwin in the background, in which the forked human animal, gathering its muslins about it, is overtaken, supported but invaded, animated, but as if by a puppeteer, by the sheer dry power of biological replication, convolution, horror vacui. Beauty exists in this world, but oxygen for it is always in short supply. The forest is enchanted, but the magic is black. What Clarke is picking up on here is what I would call the occultural quality of Victorian art. And just to define my terms, occulture is a word I get from Christopher Partridge, and it refers to the diffusion, the sort of spread, the usefulness and availability of occult ideas and themes and concepts in a wider culture, regardless of what a specific individual who's drawing on this context may themselves have believed or not believed. And what I find useful about this Clarke quote is how it picks up on the ways in which, in Victorian art, this diffuse occultism, this black magic, is wrapped up with Victorian science. And this produces a form of beauty that is sometimes, I think, utterly grotesque. And this is an intersection I think I'm always interested in my own work. And before I introduce my case study, which I'll talk about for the rest of the session, I wanted to add one thing that Clarke omits, and that is the intersection of gender and sexuality to these concerns, particularly how these shifting ideas about the body, about nature, and about beauty produce in Victorian art new and often queer configurations of selves, of bodies, and of being. And in the back, or maybe the front of my mind here, I will say, is always Susan Stryker's canonical essay, My Words to Victor Frankenstein, on reclaiming a sort of positive monstrosity, I would say, for queer ways or configurations of being, for queer reconfigurations of the body. And I bring this up because these are ideas that I think are very much in the background of the case study I'm bringing to you today. Another work, which with its dazzling colors and luminosity, doesn't perhaps seem to have much of the Gothic about it. This is a painting called Oreads from 1907. It's at Tate Britain. I think it's currently on display. And it's the magnum opus of an artist I'm very interested in at the minute, and that's the Manchester-born painter Annie Swinnerton. She was born in, let's see if I've, 1844 and died in 1933. And what I'm presenting today is the bones or sort of germ idea of an article that is very much in progress, so very open and keen for feedback. And what I'm hoping to model here in this talk anyway is how and why a cultural approach, especially one that's sensitive to science, can be useful or fruitful in illuminating Victorian art of this strange sort that I've been gesturing towards. So today, Annie Swinnerton is mostly remembered, when she's remembered at all, for becoming, at nearly 80 years old, the first woman ever elected to the Royal Academy of Art since its foundation. She considered herself self-trained, and her road to success was hard-fought. She'd be nearly 50 before receiving her first serious acclaim. Swinnerton pioneered a fascinating form of outdoor painting in which not just sort of rapid landscape sketches, but in fact full monumental symbolical allegories were painted directly out of doors in dazzling sunlight, often on the roof of her flat in Rome. And Ariadne's, our focus today, is one of these works. And what scholarship there is on Swinnerton so far does tend to foreground, I would say, a particular set of gendered concerns. So her struggles as a woman artist, in particular, reading the bodies in her art usually as centrally related to her gendered experience of struggle and also to her suffragist politics. But Swinnerton herself resented being seen primarily as a woman artist, and her interests expand far beyond this. And what I've been working towards recently is taking Swinnerton on her own terms, working to re-embed her in those intellectual contexts that I think were underlying what a reviewer called the germ ideas of her art, which is a phrase I love. And the aim is exploring not her interest in gender per se, but in what happens when gender comes undone in her work. And more than that, what happens when stably or apparently stably sexed bodies come undone. Her interest, to put it another way, in the unsexed vital energies of life and creation itself, in the formation, mutation, and transformation of biological matter. And what I've been finding, and hope to share with you today, is how using an approach which is sensitive to the context of science and the occult can enable us to read her bodies and her art in general differently. And what I'll be arguing is that Ariadne's, which is very much her magnum opus, is a painting all about those vital, unsexed powers of life, beauty, and creation, especially as these were being explored in occult scientific thinking at the time. So let's begin by looking at the painting. I don't know if you can, the painting's really massive. It's almost life-size, and it's this enormous circular format. It's really striking in real life. I highly recommend visiting it. In the painting, a group of almost life-sized nude figures, identified by the title as nymphs, emerge from a chaotic seascape. We are at the edge of some storm which has not yet fully passed. Sky and sea are still in tumult. At the left, dark clouds hang heavy with rain, and yet a sliver of rainbow shines through, and above the figures, the clouds break into the promise of some calmer day. The tumult of the storm, its heaving energy, is carried through the figures' bodies, which form a sort of vortex, spinning out. Can you see my mouse? From the sort of germ of jumbled fingers here to fan out in a spectrum that culminates in the central figure. This energy is carried through, or perhaps into or as, the figure's dynamic poses. And I'm thinking especially of this figure at right with this powerful leg who seems to leap or push out of the water. And because of that sort of vortex motion and the circular canvas edge, it almost seems to spin out into the edge of the canvas itself. And I think really working together with these effects to generate the vitality of the work is Swinnerton's energetic brushwork and her shimmering palette. And they create the sort of sense of a vibratory dynamism that's really striking in the work in person. By the time of her election to the Royal Academy, Ariadne's was considered Swinnerton's finest work. Thanks to her thick impasto brushwork, and impasto just means that it stands proud of the canvas, that it's sort of three-dimensional, it's in our space. So thanks to this impasto and to her configuration of these figures as if a sculpture group, they look sort of like a fountain. Several critics described it as, quote, a painting of sculpture more than a work of paint, unquote. But they were quick to clarify that this living statuary was not mere paint or stone. It, in fact, quote, has the breath of life in it, unquote. They describe the effects of Swinnerton's work in energized terms and as capable of actually acting on our bodies as viewers. Ariadne's, they write, carries a surge or a charge. It shocks. And I think that this shock relates in an important way to the word's subversion of gendered expectations. The bodies of Swinnerton's Oreads are strangely androgynous, possibly excepting the central figure, who we'll return to, but even then, a little bit debatable. Though nymphs are by definition female, these bronzed, muscular bodies with their close-cropped hair are figured in more conventionally masculine terms. And, oh, sorry, that's the impasto brushwork. But I just thought I'd put up some examples of some of the many precedents of male bodies in art that she is, I think, quite deliberately referencing here, especially the ephebes in the background of Michelangelo's Donitondo here, and his pensiero, refracted especially through the version of her friend Auguste Rodin, the thinker. And how unusual Swinnerton's treatment of her nymphs is in this painting can be seen in contrast with other 19th century paintings, which feature them rather more typically as lithe and pale and hyper-feminine. And critics really did not know what to do with these figures or with the woman who made them. They write of these bodies as coarse, as crude, and as curious. And it doesn't escape me that curious by this point is a common byword for homosexual, which I think is a strange epithet to apply to a married woman. Swinnerton herself is described in distinctly masculine terms. She is violent, aggressive, and virile. She seems afraid, as one critic writes, to lose her masculine grip of things if she were to venture upon the slightest approach to tenderness. And there's one review in particular written later in life that I think really gets at what I'm sort of trying to get at here. The almost superhuman vitality of this woman's painting, the critic writes, might tempt one to call her a Lancashire witch, only witch seems too feminine. Technically, she's a wizard. It is the dauntless, virile, almost colossal method of attack, which seems to be beyond anything of its kind in the present age. So for her critics, Swinnerton imbues her art with life, but not in the way sort of the tender or natural instincts of a mother would canonically enable. She puts the vital spark in these works in some other way, with the unnatural, perhaps even supernatural, masculine power of a wizard. And for this reviewer, even to call her a witch, that most unnatural, that most unsexed of women, is to over-feminize her. And what I've been working to do is to try and meet Swinnerton here as witch, at the curious, unsexed juncture between flesh and form, and matter and energy, in the shallow relief modeled by thick brushwork, where the pulsations of life inhere. And I think Oriades is quite centrally, as we'll see, about the life-giving powers of the artists, and as I said, about that bigger sort of a vital energy of the creative act itself, a vital unsexed energy. And I think that Swinnerton teases these out is sort of drawing on the resources of cultural ideas from Victorian science about the nature and origins of life, about the action of energy, and about sort of the vibratory rhythms of life to figure this sculptural group. Swinnerton came of age in a self-consciously scientific era, one which witnessed not only a sea change in the nature and practice of science wholesale, but also the widespread diffusion of scientific ideas and theories among the broader public. And by the 1870s, when she started painting professionally, scientific developments had radically reconfigured Victorian understandings of the world. With geology, we had a sense for the first time of unimaginably deep time, while evolutionary theory revealed humankind's profound interrelationship with other life. But never mind. A new sense of the body emerged from physics and physiology as an entity plugged into a thrumming field, charged with energized matter in constant motion and flux. And at its most basic level, at an atomic or even subatomic level, matter was being re-envisaged as vibratory, as spinning in vortex motions in the all-pervading ether, which is the invisible and yet physical medium that was understood to fill all space and conduct energy. And a lot of my previous work has looked at how Victorian artists set about engaging or mobilizing these ideas in imaginative ways, and I think Swinnerton's no different. In Oriades, every part of the picture plane is saturated with energy and vibratory motion. Her quick, loose brushwork transforms sea and sky into fields of agitation, sometimes sort of as waveform ripples. You can see some of that over here. And elsewhere as shimmering vibrations. That's sort of more in the clouds and this figure's hair. All of the substance in this painting seems to be composed of the same energized stuff, pervading and connecting everything like the ether of space. And so the hair of this figure, for instance, is really blending into, is sort of becoming one with the dissipating clouds. And here, with the Oriades emerge from the water, there's this really strange sort of indeterminate space that's right at eye level, in which flesh and sky and stone and sea seem to merge or seem to share some sort of essential identity. And a feature that especially strikes me in person is that the clouds are the same sort of fleshy pink as the bodies of the figures. We know that other artists in Swinnerton's orbit, like the spiritualist painter Evelyn de Morgan, engaged with similar ideas through the popular occultural writing of physicists like Oliver Lodge, for instance. And Lodge is a fascinating figure. He was a pioneer of radio and of other sort of telecoms. And he devoted a substantial portion of his career to the argument that the immortality of the soul was fully compatible with modern physics. And he wasn't alone. You know, many mainstream practicing scientists in the period were equally invested in the idea that the existence of spirit and its immortality were, yes, fully compatible with the laws of the physical universe. Lodge wrote several popular books in the period arguing that ether, that sort of energized medium thought to fill all space, was both the conduit for and perhaps the substance of the immortal soul. And in some of my work on De Morgan, whose painting you can see on the right here, I've been looking at how in paintings slightly earlier than Swinnerton's Oreads, she was drawing on the ideas of Lodge and his collaborator Frederick Myers, who we'll get back to depict ether bodies spinning like vortex atoms. And again, you have this sort of, that vortex, that spinning, sort of radiating aureole effect. And so she depicts these sort of ether bodies that are spinning into a form of visibility, this very sort of fleeting and yet material physical embodiment. And for De Morgan, because she's a spiritualist, it's sort of easier to see the analogy here, right? It's an analogy to the real presence and the undying energies of the soul. You know, a spirit is also something that straddles sort of a transient materiality and yet is believed by spiritualists to be physically in the world. Swinnerton, I think, is a little bit more complicated. We don't know much about her beliefs. Like a lot of women artists, there's basically no archive of writings by her. But what I will say is that Oreads would not be the first or the last time she would paint figures of human and stubbornly fleshy appearance as embodiments of otherwise energetic and quasi-spiritual entities. And so this is St. Martin's Summer, one of my absolute favorites, in which an angelic embodiment of heat or light emerges from the clouds with these wings that look like a slab of butcher's meat, like meat on a butcher's table. And in the soul's journey on the right, a soul is sort of flitting at superhuman speed across a landscape in which, again, mountains and clouds and spirit are all comprised of the same fleshy substance. And to me, Swinnerton's fleshiness, you know, the sculptural qualities of her works that her contemporaries picked up on, indicate that in very Victorian fashion, we are not just in the world of energy physics, but also in the world of biology and also in the world of geology. This is really sort of a transdisciplinary sort of approach. There's a cultural understanding of the world. And my sense is that unfolding in Oreads is a vital developmental metaphor that moves across two timescales at the same time. One spans eons, the other a single lifetime. One fans out to encompass the vast species-level unfolding of life itself, and the other spins inwards to coalesce as the individual creative impulse. Still with me? There's a little bit of science left. There's Myers, and then we're done with the science. In the article that I'm writing, the scientific text I'm most interested in is one by Lodge's close friend, the psychical researcher Frederick Myers. And that's because this book, Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death of 1903, really seems to draw these strands together. It's a text I'm pretty confident Swinnerton knew. Myers moved in her social circles and collaborated closely with her friend William James, who himself wrote several essays on Myers' text. And in Human Personality, which is really a remarkable book, Myers bridged biology, physics, psychology, aesthetics, and psychical research to develop a concept of the self as a continuum, suspended between matter, the sort of conscious mind on the one end, and spirit, the subconscious on the other, and energized physically by impulses, by sort of electromagnetic impulses passing along it. In his most famous analogy, he likened this composite self to the light spectrum, which, like a rainbow, which appears in Swinnerton's work, was at once unitary and multiplex. On the one end of the spectrum were the thoughts and feelings and bodily sensations of which we were conscious, and on the other end was the part of ourself connected to the spirit realm. And I think it's quite important, and again, it's quite similar to Swinnerton, that his metaphor was not just luminous or etheric, but also biological. And he even refers to the oceanic, which I find quite striking in relation to this work. In his most famous analogy, he wrote that the threshold of consciousness was like, quote, the phosphorescent ripple on an unsounded sea, and like the ripple, it is not only superficial, but manifold, unquote. Which for me, or to put it another way, means that like Swinnerton's vibratory impasto three-dimensional brushwork or her living statuary group, it has depth. And Myers was particularly interested in, we'll come back to that, Myers was interested in the workings of creative inspiration, which he called genius. And a sort of side quest that I'm not supposed to be going down is I've been thinking a lot about Frederick Myers as art critic, and this, especially this idea of creative genius that he comes up with, because I think it's absolutely fascinating. So he describes genius, the moment of creative inspiration, as an uprush, shooting up from oceanic depths into conscious awareness. Again, in terms I think reminiscent of Ariadne's, he writes that artistic genius is a coalescing of formlessness into form, a crystallizing of fluid ideas, or, if you will, a concentrating and throwing upwards in its clear fountain a maze of subterranean streams. And I think that this Wordsworth quote that he refers to is even more pertinent, and this is the very moment of creative inspiration that he's talking about. Some lovely image in the song rose up, full-formed, like Venus rising from the sea. And one thing you might not be able to see in this tiny reproduction is that the two central Ariads are in fact singing. I think song and sort of, echo is the most famous of the Ariads from the Echo and Narcissus myth, is also very much part of this, but that's besides today's point. But I do think it's relevant that the central figure in Swinnerton's painting so strongly recalls some sort of classical or Renaissance Venus. And this fact, to me, is a strong indication that the painting is indeed about creative processes like the ones of interest to Myers. Venus is herself, of course, an embodiment of beauty per se, and she recurs in this form across Victorian art. I've put an example by Walter Crane on the bottom here. But her presence in the ocean, especially by the 19th century, also vividly recalls the myth of her own origins, including as represented in works that Swinnerton knew well. And in Ariadne's, Venus seems to be springing from the sea foam, which in person is conspicuously the most dimensional part of the canvas. It's the most sort of 3D. And it recalls to me the legend of Aphrodite's birth from sea foam, but the version of this in which her birth is created by the severed genitals of Uranus. And you can actually see, I mean, there's something like, there's a sort of castration happening here with this particularly masculine figure and then this kind of phallic fish dropping off between his legs. And then I don't know if you can see, but in the corner of the painting here too, there's also a sort of severed fleshy part that is unrelated to anything else in the picture. And this version of Venus's birth, because it's asexual, because it's without the participation of a mother, was taken up by writers of Swinnerton's generation as a symbol, the Uranians, as a symbol for the higher ennobling male homosexual love. And it's related to Venus as a stand-in, I think, for other modes of unsexed creation as well, like art. And it also brings us sort of full circle to point to evolutionary debate at the turn of the century, because the Venus myth meets Victorian science, where debates about the origins of life and nature of heredity sort of continued to rage. And something that I think's been a bit, what's the word, memory hold, is that in this sort of 1900 to 1910 period, we haven't really settled on Darwinian evolution per se as sort of the dominant evolution. There's a whole strand of Lamarckianism that's come back, etc. But anyway, evolution is still very much being debated, being discussed at the time. And one of the main questions is, how could life have emerged asexually, basically from nothing? How did the spark of life come from nothing? And how did this unfold in time? And I think that the sort of fertile ocean of Swinnerton's really calls that to mind. And very briefly, I want to talk you through the evolutionary narrative. That's the dimensional part of the canvas I was talking about. I just want to talk you through the evolutionary narrative that I think is at work here. You have the sort of crouching mass at the left, splitting and fanning ever upwards and outwards into the central Venus. And across that sort of flow or unfolding, I think, is a developmental allegory in which baser, primitive, almost formless matter is sort of splitting and separating into individuals of increasing complexity and perfection. The bodies at the bottom left have no faces and only the beginnings of individuation. Between them here is this really indeterminate zone of sort of excessive flesh where it's unclear if they're fully separated from each other. And even the standing figure who falls into shadow behind the Venus has not really fully emerged. The sort of flat and indistinct surface of her body below the waist, which fans out here, actually kind of looks like a fishy tail, especially its proximity to the fish on the right. And Swinnerton's colossal bodies, which are very much in person the sort of color and texture of wet clay, also recall the paintings about evolution by her friend and mentor, G.F. Watts, who treated the subject explicitly in works like Evolution. And I just, observe the similarity of sort of these two figures from the waist up. But I think a big difference between them is that Watts is figuring evolution through a metaphor of maternal reproduction. This is Gaia, sort of with her myriad offspring, whereas Swinnerton, I think, is summoning some other more primordial vital force, an ungendered power that is sort of splitting and fanning out and animating the rough clay of the earth. And again, I think this is echoed in the breakdown of easy binarized gender in Swinnerton's androgynous figures, which again, in turn, recall Darwin's theorization of our species' hermaphroditic origins. I said there were two timescales unfolding here. That is the one of eons. That is sort of the grand evolutionary process, the sort of colossal process. At the same time, I think Swinnerton invokes timeframes on the other end of the spectrum, the flux of the present, the instant of the fish's leap, and the spinning rush of the vortex culminating in the individual life. These unfurling bodies in her painting recall the processes of deep time, but also the development of the individual embryo from a single germ or cell via a process of rapid splitting and duplicating. And this is not my own interpretative leap. By the turn of the century, the idea that each organism's individual embryonic development recapitulated or retraced step by step that of the species as a whole was a very well-known idea. And more than that, it was central to Myers' theory of creative genius, which again is gathering up evolution, embryology, energy, and the oceanic to explain its functioning. Myers held that creative inspiration emerged into being as an uprush in the self. And crucially, although the impulse could be fleeting, its source ran deep. Inspiration was always, in fact, quote, a matter of memory, by which he meant not only the memory of the individual, but that of life itself, some sort of, it's quite Bergsonian, I think, actually, some sort of unconscious recollection, an echo in the self, actually drawing on some primordial, communal, embodied knowledge that was latent in the ether. Drawing on recapitulation theory, Myers argued that each individual held within it an ocean of hereditary or prenatal memories generated by eons of interaction between nature and life. Merging this with the older occultural idea that the universe held latent in it a print, a physical memory of all that had ever been, Myers theorized that everything that was ever to come had always been present, stored within us, in the very protoplasm or primary basis of all organic life. For Myers, nothing was ever new, only revealed. And in making this case, he specifically points to historical sculptors and painters like Praxiteles and Tintoretto to make his case for creativity as something which emerges from revelations brought out of the sort of shared, primal, latent memory. In an interview given late in life, Swinnerton explained her working process. She began with a moment of inspiration, what her interviewer called, again, the germ idea of her art. And this would then develop directly on the canvas, unfurling organically and spontaneously without her working out the composition beforehand. In Myers' terms, these creative uprushes, though organic and impulsive, stemmed in fact from the vast reservoir of embodied memory shared in and by all vital beings, including every artist who has ever lived. And I think that this dynamic is very much at work in Ariadne's. What I've been arguing is that in this painting, the vital germ, the center of that vortex is, for Swinnerton, the creative impulse itself, spun out into a broader developmental narrative encompassing her understanding of the processes of artistic creation. And this is visualized, I've been arguing, via cultural ideas from a range of Victorian sciences, brought together via Myers and encompassing two coexisting impulses, the eon and the instant, the communal and the individual. And just briefly, I think the fact that Swinnerton shares Myers's understanding of this notion that every creative invention is in fact the echo or recall of some primordial pre-existing latent form is indicated in the myriad art historical references that are in this work. You can keep digging. This is a smattering of them. And worth pointing out, both by men and women artists. And I think the fact that these references are all in a way imperfect, that they strongly recall yet do not directly replicate their precedents, also indicates to me that we're in the world of memory more than direct mimesis. Swinnerton embeds herself self-consciously in this, her masterpiece, in an art historical lineage of greats recalled here in a vast temporal lineage unfolding like the processes of deep time, in an unsexed yet vital creative lineage spanning eons, yet summoned by her quivering vitality and her evocation of the instantaneous flux into an ongoing present and into her individual work of art. What's more, and worth stressing that this is the feature of Swinnerton's art that reviewers long identified as the most salient feature, she makes this vitality palpable to us in our ever-going present. This, I think, is the power of the witch, not only putting the breath of life into the work, but ensuring that this powerful unsexed vitality, like her dimensional brushwork, like the vibratory energies she conveys, passes continuously through the canvas with the power to actually act on us. And I love, there's a quote that by one reviewer that I think about a lot, where he wrote that the painting actually radiates health and vigor. One feels stronger just by looking at it. I'm more or less done. I don't have a particularly profound set of concluding thoughts, but I just wanted to stress again sort of the strangeness, the monstrosity in some parts, but also the vitality and maybe even joy that Swinnerton summons and celebrates here. We are, again, in that realm of nature as overgrownness, as Clarke says, with Darwin in the background, with the forked human animal, with the sense that it is being overtaken by the sheer dry power of biological replication. But yeah, we're not in the enchanted forest. And I think that Swinnerton, even if, she might bring us out of the enchanted forest and into the sunlight, into the sort of the churn and the dazzle of the glittering ocean, we have no wider vista than before. And the Gothic or the occult, I think, is no further away. The magic is still undeniably black, but it's also strangely beautiful. Thank you.
That was so brilliant, Emma. So if we can give some digital rounds of applause. There's also been lots of activity in the chat that you might want to have a little catch up with when you get a sec.
Definitely.
That was so interesting. Like, learned so much, have so many questions as well. I'm also even